Neuromancer by William Gibson is the book often most credited with starting the cyberpunk genre, which is a sci-fi subgenre that rose to prominence in the 1980s and continues to be both popular and highly influential to this day. We see cyberpunk influence our hobby perhaps more strongly than any other I've encountered. Besides the obvious influences, like the recent-ish video game that carries the same moniker, there are also many more subtle hints at how important the genre is to miniature wargaming. Games like Necromunda, Infinity, and Stargrave all to some degree seek to capture and convey the messages of cyberpunk, whether directly or through some kind of flavourful reimagining. The popularity of the synthwave paint scheme? Cyberpunk introduced us to the idea of clashing neons. Similarly, synthwave music, which is perhaps one of the more popular choices for content creators to use as background music, that too is born of the cyberpunk genre. Miniature design itself is always an obvious space where cyberpunk could more openly influence our hobby. The entire Infinity line proudly proclaims itself as both cyberpunk and manga inspired, often both at once. Moreover, miniature wargamers tend to also share other hobbies and interests such as video games, sci-fi movies and books, where cyberpunk also plays a huge role. If you're watching this and don't think you're a fan of the genre, chances are you just never realised you are. Cyberpunk might not always be the most obvious genre to pin down. High-tech alone can easily be looked at as generic sci-fi. It is instead the message of the genre that really defines whether or not something should be included within it. Above all else, cyberpunk is a warning about the dangers of unchecked capitalism, about transhumanism and the loss of the self, about social decay and wealth divide. These are all topics that the vast majority of people alive today can strongly relate to. Perhaps the most key point of the genre is exactly its relatability. Whilst fantastical to some degree, the fantasy is usually the entertainment aspect, providing engagement and interest, whilst the message is what's really driven home underneath that. I'd like to explore these topics more closely and talk about how and why they relate to wargaming and what they teach us, to demonstrate why I feel this genre is so important to our space, and to convey at least some of why it captures my imagination and interest so strongly. Corruption, greed, and dominance by the wealthy are often themes in cyberpunk. It's in fact commonplace for megacorporations to be framed as the main antagonists in cyberpunk storylines. And in almost every iteration of the theme, the wealthy are seen as bad guys. This is a very interesting point when we relate it to wargaming, because I think we often can overlook just how lucky we are to be able to have this hobby. Miniature wargaming is expensive. It also requires a ton of free time. Chances are, if you can afford to take part, you're probably doing better for yourself than a lot of others. Or at least, you have to make a lot of sacrifices in order to keep up with the hobby. The heroes in Cyberpunk tend to be the poorest and most downtrodden, the most forgotten about. And whilst miniature wargamers are rarely one-percenters, I do enjoy that the genre offers us reminders to not forget about those who maybe aren't doing as well as we are. It asks us to pause for thought and consider if we can contribute to the improvement of the lives of others. At the very least, it reminds us to try not to contribute to the detriment of those lives. There's a wonderful scene in one of the When Gravity Fails books where, after receiving corrupt money for running errands for a politician/crime boss kind of figure, the protagonist, Marid Ordrain, gives all of his cash to a begging woman, seemingly for no reason. The scene is deeply analytical of the best and worst of humanity at once, where Marid is tripping down a path of deeper involvement with the underworld, experiencing disgust and guilt toward the dirty money. But rather than throw it away, His first thought is to try to use it to improve the life of someone vulnerable. Cyberpunk teaches us similar lessons in its analysis of transhumanism, the development of human-enhancing technologies, and the discussion of at which point these things can be considered to have made us no longer human. If we look at how much our hobby has changed in the internet age, how much more tribal it has become, and how the speed of dissemination of information has made everyone an overnight expert, we see a clear micro of the same macro that Cyberpunk warns us about. These themes of transhumanism are discussed at great length in the lore of some of our favourite miniature games. For all its ham-fistedness and slightly dodgy glorifications, Warhammer 40k is vastly entertaining in how it portrays human interaction with technology, and there are absolutely some lessons to take away there. But for me, the lore of Infinity is perhaps where we see the cyberpunk genre demonstrated in such incredibly relatable ways. In Infinity, humanity is comfortable. We've invented a benevolent AI that watches over us and has solved world hunger. We've solved the overcrowding crisis through space exploration and extraterrestrial colonization, yet still we fight amongst ourselves. The Hack-Islam faction hold the secrets to eternal life and near limitless personal power. Whilst these secrets are used to protect and improve the lives of others, they're only given to those who can afford them. Even when all of our basic needs are taken care of and quality of life is at an all-time high, Infinity portrays a future humanity who are never satisfied and have learned so little from the mistakes of the past. Driven by greed and lust for power, the factions of humanity continue to carry out clandestine warfare against each other. Even the existential threat of first contact with a malevolent alien race isn't enough to shake us from our propensity to destroy ourselves. It could be easy, and I honestly wouldn't blame you, to see the genre as somewhat bleak. And indeed, on the surface, it probably is. But that bleakness is there to grab our attention and ask us to consider the messages being delivered. Whilst the downfall of society and the erosion of human values are never going to be easy topics to discuss, Cyberpunk at least does us the service of providing an entertaining backdrop, usually with lots of guns, explosions, cool hackers, and amazing visuals. So let's discuss instead some of those visual cues and try to lift the mood a little. Neons against black are one of the first things that will spring to mind when you think of Cyberpunk, and we definitely have seen a trend for this in miniature painting over the last couple of years. The wonderful Dana Howell has a YouTube channel with lots of lovely synthwave painting, and I'd definitely recommend giving that a look. Beyond that, Cyberpunk loves to show us mirror shades, visored helmets, form-fitting panelled tactical armour, and cool reimaginings of modern day and historical weaponry. In miniatures, we see this influence even creeping outside of the direct cyberpunk genre. Whilst typically it would be called a dystopian space fantasy rather than cyberpunk, Warhammer 40k definitely borrows a ton of these cues, as well as dipping into things like classic fantasy, history, and even steampunk at times. Perhaps the most striking visual element cyberpunk can lend to our hobby, though, is in its environments. Gaming tables are often sparse affairs, populated with a hodgepodge of thrown together bits of whatever is available. A more concerted effort in creating a gaming table always goes down a treat, but it was the first time I saw a properly set up cyberpunk table that my mind was truly blown. Imagine for a second some of the environments that might pertain to a cyberpunk setting. A sprawling research centre with artificial gardens and perfectly tended walkways. A grimy, densely packed cityscape with graffiti, neon signs and dark alleyways. Seeing these kinds of environments brought to life in miniature is a truly breathtaking experience. There's a reason I'm spending literally months and months just head planning my Infinity table before I make a single purchase. Whether it inspires us through its story or lends us its visuals, Cyberpunk plays a huge role in at least the sci-fi section of the miniature wargaming hobby. I'm not going to try and tell you it influences the fantasy games too, although, to be honest, if I was really looking for parallels, I'd be willing to bet I could find them. But for those of us who love sci-fi, futuristic, or indeed directly cyberpunk itself in the form of wargames, I think we can all agree we owe a hell of a lot to this one book.